Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a really big one, socialism. It's definitely multifaceted.
It really is.
We've pulled together quite a range of sources looking at its meaning, its history, and, well, all the different shapes it's taken over time. So if you want to get a handle on what this influential set of ideas is all about, without getting totally bogged down in academic jargon, hopefully this is the place.
Exactly. Socialism isn't just one simple thing, is it? It's dynamic, often controversial. Our mission here is really to unpack it, go beyond the simple definitions. Look at what it is, where the core ideas actually came from, and how they've been understood and, put into practice, often in really different ways. We want to hit those key insights, give you the bigger picture.
Okay, let's do it. So where should we start? Maybe the word itself.
Yeah.
The foundation.
Good idea. Our sources trace socialism back to the Latin sociare.
Sociare.
Yeah, meaning to combine or to share. And that's connected to societas, which means things like companionship, but also, interestingly, like a legal agreement between people.
So a basic idea, people coming together, sharing, cooperating.
That's the root of it, yeah. And it's fascinating how this sort of basic concept really took political shape in the 19th century.
When did the actual term emerge?
Well, Pierre Leroux claimed he coined socialism around 1832. He was heavily influenced by Henri de Saint-Simon, one of the early utopian socialists.
And this was happening against a specific backdrop, right?
Absolutely. It was a direct response to the rise of liberal individualism. Individualism was the big idea then, focusing on the single person.
Yeah.
But the Industrial Revolution was raging, and the social costs, terrible poverty, huge inequality, were becoming just impossible to ignore. Individualism didn't seem to have the answers for that.
So these early socialists, people like Saint-Simon you mentioned and Robert Owen too, they saw this focus on the individual as, well, part of the problem, especially with all the chaos around them.
Precisely. They felt it was breaking down community, creating real suffering. Their answer, broadly speaking, was some kind of shared ownership of resources.
Okay, shared ownership, but did they agree on how?
Not really, and that's key. Even right at the start, you see different visions. Saint-Simon, he leaned towards economic planning, a kind of scientific administration, more top-down.
And Owen?
Owen was all about cooperatives, grassroots stuff, restructuring how things were made and owned from bottom up.
So that tension, centralized control versus decentralized, local organization that was there from the very beginning.
Definitely.
No.
It's a theme that just keeps coming back in socialist history.
Interesting. And the term itself, socialism, it caught on in different places.
Yeah. Leroux and Saint-Simon were big in France, but sources also mention Marie Roch-Louis-Raybaud helping to popularize it there. Over in Britain, it was really Robert Owen and his cooperative movement that made the term stick.
Got it. So, moving through the 19th century.
By the 1860s or so, socialism was becoming the main term. It started pushing out others like associationists or collectivists. And interestingly, communism actually became less common in general use for a while.
Right, okay, this is where it gets tricky. The socialism versus communism thing. How were they seen differently at first?
Initially, there was kind of a distinction. Socialism was seen as focusing on socializing production, how stuff gets made. Think factories, land, owned socially.
And communism.
Communism, in that early thinking, was maybe more radical. It aimed to socialize both production and consumption. Some even imagined a future where you could just take goods freely as needed.
Wow, okay. Collective factories versus just taking what you need from a collective pot. Big difference.
Huge difference. But then Marx and Engels came along and really changed the conversation.
How so?
Well, by 1888, Engels, for instance, was using socialism and communism almost as synonyms. They basically saw communism as an older word for the same fundamental goal.
So Marx himself didn't necessarily draw a sharp line.
The Oxford Handbook of Karl Marx actually points this out. Marx used the terms pretty fluidly. The idea of them being distinct historical stages, socialism, then communism, that was more of a later development in Marxist thought. This blurring is really important to grasp.
So the neat distinction we often think of today wasn't always there. Then Lenin comes in after the Bolshevik Revolution.
Right, and Lenin strategically redefines socialism. He frames it as a transitional stage between capitalism and full communism.
Why do that? What was the logic?
Part of it was practical. Critics were saying Russia wasn't economically ready for communism, according to Marxist theory at the time. It was too backward.
Ah.
Okay, so by calling the current phase socialism, Lenin could argue it was a necessary step towards communism, a more gradual progression. And that definition really stuck, shaping how we often distinguish them now.
And didn't the party name change reinforce that?
Absolutely. In 1918, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party became the All-Russian Communist Party. That move explicitly linked the term communism to Bolshevism and Lenin's specific ideology. The split became definitive.
It's amazing how politics shapes the language itself.
Yeah.
You also mentioned our sources say socialism might have just sounded better in some places.
Yeah, that's interesting too. In heavily Christian parts of Europe, communism sometimes got linked with atheism, which was a big barrier.
Okay.
And in Protestant England, apparently the word communism sounded a bit too much like the Catholic communion rite for some people's comfort.
Huh. Never thought of that.
Right. And Engels himself noted this back in 1848 when they published the Communist Manifesto. He said socialism was actually considered quite respectable intellectually in Europe then.
But communism wasn't.
Communism was seen as much more suspect, even scary. Mainstream socialists were debating ideas. Communists were often seen as part of these more radical working-class movements demanding fundamental change, sometimes violently.
But it wasn't just radicals and revolutionaries, was it? Didn't someone like John Stuart Mill engage with these ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. Mill, who you wouldn't call a radical, later argued that standard economic theory didn't actually rule out a socialist economic system. He even became quite supportive of worker cooperatives. Shows a certain openness.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and look at the broader history. Where did the movement itself come from?
Its intellectual roots really go back to the Enlightenment and the French Revolution times that fundamentally questioned old hierarchies.
And then Marx and Engels?
Right. The Communist Manifesto in the late 1840s, that was huge. It laid out what they called scientific socialism, claiming it was based on a material understanding of history, not just ideals.
And after that, did parties form?
Yes, the late 19th century saw democratic socialist parties popping up all over Europe, mostly drawing on Marxist ideas. And here's a fun fact. The Australian Labor Party apparently formed the world's very first socialist government briefly in Queensland in 1899.
Wow, okay. Didn't expect that. In the 20th century,
Yeah.
the Soviet Union looms large, right?
Hugely. The Soviet Union and the communist parties aligned with it represented a major model of socialism for much of the century. Central planning, state ownership. That was their formula.
But heavily criticized, too.
Oh, massively. Especially for the lack of democracy, the authoritarianism. That model wasn't universally accepted within socialist circles, not by a long shot.
And China, of course.
Yes, socialism became dominant in China after 1949. You had huge changes like land redistribution, but also terrible periods like the Great Leap Forward.
And even within one country, like the UK, there were different ideas of what socialism meant in practice.
Definitely. You had Herbert Morrison from the Labor Party basically saying socialism is just what the Labor government does, very pragmatic.
As opposed to
Someone like Aneurin Bevan, who argued for much deeper changes, public control of major industries, real economic planning, and importantly, workers having a say, workers' democracy.
And in many Western countries, it wasn't all or nothing, was it? We saw mixed economies develop.
Exactly. Socialist or social democratic governments brought in nationalizations of some industries, built up big social welfare systems, trying to blend socialist goals with markets.
Then the 60s happened. The New Left.
Right. A really diverse movement. They were often critical of the Soviet Union for being authoritarian and critical of traditional social democrats for being, well, too cozy with capitalism.
So what did they want?
Generally, more decentralized forms of collective ownership. Things like worker co-ops, community councils, more power from below.
And then the big shift at the end of the century.
Yeah, the collapse of the Soviet Union and communism in Eastern Europe in 89-91. That was a massive moment.
How did socialist movements adapt after that?
Many increasingly aligned with other social justice causes, environmentalism. Feminism became really central, broadening the focus. More recently, though, many observers talk about a drift to the right in mainstream subtle democratic parties in Europe. Policies becoming more market-oriented.
And attempts to form new alliances.
Yes, things like the Progressive Alliance, trying to link up different progressive and socialist groups internationally.
Our sources also mentioned PASOKification. What's that about?
Yeah. It's named after the Greek party, PASOK. It refers to the sharp decline in votes that some established social democratic parties have seen this century.
Why?
Often linked to things like economic crises, austerity measures they implemented, it raises big questions about whether that traditional model is still working in today's world. Globalization, financial instability, new political challenges. It's tough.
Definitely a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
Okay, let's pivot to the core principles. What fundamentally drives socialist thought? And what are its main criticisms of capitalism?
Well, a central goal, really across the board, is to create a system of production that's more advanced, more rational than capitalism, more productive, more efficient.
For what purpose?
Ultimately, to lay the groundwork for more freedom and more equality for everyone.
And there's a core belief about human nature, or rather, nurture.
Exactly. Socialists generally believe human behavior isn't fixed. It's heavily shaped by our social environment, the norms, the values, the culture, and crucially, the economic system we live in. And these things are man-made. They can be changed.
So problems aren't necessarily because people are inherently greedy or flawed.
Right. The critique focuses more on the material conditions, the system, the economic structure that encourages certain behaviors over others. It's not about blaming individuals.
Like Bertrand Russell, you mentioned him. His socialism wasn't just about class war.
No, Russell saw socialism more as a way to reorganize the economy to benefit everyone, maybe even leading to less work time because technology could be used more rationally for the common good, not just profit. A different emphasis than pure Marxist class struggle.
What about inequality? That's a big theme, right?
Huge. Socialists are deeply critical of the extreme income gaps you often see under capitalism. They argue it creates instability, social problems.
And the solutions under capitalism, like welfare or high taxes.
They argue those are often inefficient patches. Necessary, maybe, but they can weaken market incentives and don't fix the underlying issue, which they see as the ownership structure.
And Marxists take that critique even further.
Yes. For Marxists, the basic conflict between owners, capitalists, and workers, labor, is built into capitalism. It inherently prevents us from using our resources and technology in the best way possible for everyone. Only social ownership, they argue, can fix that fundamental clash.
Even the early socialists, the utopians and Ricardians, they saw problems with concentrated wealth and power.
Absolutely. They argued capitalism concentrated wealth and power unfairly, and also that it just wasn't very good at using technology and resources for the public benefit.
Okay, let's zoom in on the Marxist view specifically. We touched on the socialism-communism interchangeability.
Right. Marx and Engels used them fluidly, but later Marxists developed that clearer distinction. Socialism as this transitional phase after capitalism, but before full communism.
And what defines that socialist stage in their theory?
The key thing is a working class, the proletariat, taking control of the means of production, usually through what they called a worker state.
And there are different stages within communism in this later view.
Exactly. They talked about a lower stage, that's socialism, where the principle is from each according to his ability to each according to his contribution. Basically, you get rewarded for the work you do.
Okay, and the higher stage.
That's full communism. The principle there is from each according to his ability to each according to his need. The idea is that production becomes so advanced, there's such abundance, especially with automation, that people can just take what they need.
Which requires a massive leap in efficiency.
A massive leap, yes. It assumes scarcity is largely overcome.
And Marx's core argument about why this change would happen.
He saw a basic contradiction in capitalism. Production becomes more and more social, collective workers cooperating in big factories, complex supply chains.
But ownership stays private.
Exactly. Private ownership by a few. Marx argued this clash between social production and private ownership would inevitably make the working class want collective ownership, a system that matches how they actually work together.
Now, what about the state? Does socialism always mean a powerful state? Views seem to differ a lot.
They really do. Take Ferdinand Lassalle back in the 19th century. He had this idea of state socialism.
How is that different from Marx?
Marx saw the state as basically a tool of the ruling class, something that would eventually wither away under communism. Lassalle disagreed. He saw the state more as an independent force, something that could actually be used by the workers to achieve socialist goals, to bring about justice.
So the state as a potential tool for good, not just an instrument of oppression.
Right. A very different take than Marx's view of the state ultimately disappearing.
We also hear about utopian versus scientific socialism. What's the difference there?
Utopian socialism is the label given, often later and sometimes critically, to those early thinkers like Saint-Simon, Fourier, Owen. Their ideas about ideal societies were really influential, even inspiring Marx.
But later socialists called them utopian negatively.
Yeah, particularly Marxists who promoted scientific socialism. They used utopian to suggest those earlier ideas were just wishful thinking based on morals or blueprints, not on a hard-headed analysis of history and economics like they claimed their own scientific approach was.
It's about grounding the ideas in material reality versus just idealism.
That was the claim, yeah.
And socialism hasn't just been about economics and politics, has it? It's intersected with culture, too.
Definitely. Think about the counterculture movements of the 60s and onwards. The New Left, especially, was deeply connected to all that challenging norms, anti-racism, anti-imperialism, demands for direct democracy. These became part of their socialist vision.
So you see socialist groups involved in things like anti-war protests.
Absolutely. The Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, things like Love Music, Hate Racism, Unite Against Fascism. Lots of examples of socialists being active in broader social justice struggles.
Okay, let's dive into the economics. The core idea is social ownership of the means of production.
That's the common thread, yes.
But how that works in practice? That's where the debates happen, right? Markets versus planning.
Exactly. That's the big question. One major model is the planned economy. Social ownership, but production and resources are coordinated centrally, usually by the state.
Like the Soviet Union.
The classic example, yes. Theoretically, it lets you mobilize resources quickly for big goals like rapid industrialization.
With the downside.
Huge challenges, getting the right information, responding to what people actually want, the lack of price signals you get from markets. It proved very difficult.
So what's the alternative?
Well, there's the idea of a self-managed economy. This pushes decision-making downwards towards autonomous self-regulating units, decentralized.
Who supported this kind of idea?
Thinkers like Alfred Marshall, even John Stuart Mill, saw potential here. The goal is to avoid the rigidities of central planning. You see variations like labor-managed firms, worker-managed firms.
Right.
The aim is often to get rid of exploitation and alienation by giving workers direct control.
And other related ideas?
There's guild socialism, workers controlling industries through democratic guilds. And the cooperative economy model, basically a market system, but most firms are worker-owned and managed, deciding wages and conditions democratically.
Has technology played a role in thinking about planning?
There have been attempts. Project Cybersyn in Chile under Allende, the proposed OGAS system in the Soviet Union. They tried to use early computing and cybernetics for better, maybe more decentralized planning.
Interesting. And participatory economics.
That's another model. Planning happens through networks of worker and consumer councils, bottom up. And pay is often based on effort and sacrifice, not just output.
Seems like a lot of focus on decentralization and democracy in these models.
Yes, trying to find ways to coordinate clumsic economies without resorting to either pure markets or top-down state control. You even see echoes in things like open source software today. Collaborative, self-managed, common ownership of the code.
Upton Sinclair's definition comes to mind. Social ownership and democratic control.
That really captures the spirit of many of these models.
What about historical examples of this bottom-up control?
Early on, things like the workers' councils, the Soviets, in Russia before the Bolsheviks consolidated power. And under communism takes it furthest of abolish the state, private property, capitalism entirely, replace it with common ownership and free association.
And anarcho-syndicalism.
That puts worker unions, syndicates at the center. The idea is they manage the economy directly. We saw this in practice during the Spanish Revolution with groups like the CNT.
Yugoslavia had a unique system too, didn't it?
It did. A mix of market mechanisms, social ownership, not quite state, not quite private, and worker self-management within firms. A really fascinating, complex experiment.
And in modern examples, like Mondragon.
Richard Wolff often points to the Mondragon cooperatives in Spain as a successful example of large-scale worker self-direction. He sees it as a potential path beyond both traditional capitalism and state socialism.
Okay, then there's the state-directed economy. How does that fit in?
This is where the state takes a very active role in guiding the economy, even if they're still private property. Lots of state ownership in key sectors, strategic intervention.
And market socialism. Is that similar?
Market socialism covers a range of ideas. The common element is using market mechanisms, supply and demand, prices to allocate resources, but the profits or surplus generated benefits society as a whole, not just private owners. This happens through various forms of social, public, or collective ownership of capital.
China's system is often described this way, right?
Yes, the socialist market economy with Chinese characteristics, it's a real hybrid. A huge state sector exists alongside a very large and dynamic private sector. Though it's worth noting, many analysts look at the massive role of the state and call it state capitalism instead.
Vietnam, too.
A somewhat similar path after their Doi Moi reforms. Markets play a big role, but the state keeps firm control over key industries.
Okay, let's switch to politics. It's just as diverse, isn't it? Starting with anarchism.
Absolutely. Anarchism, fundamentally, is about rejecting compulsory government, a stateless society based on voluntary cooperation. The core idea is opposition to authority and hierarchy in all forms.
But there are different types of anarchism.
Oh, yes. Collectivist, communist, mutualist, individualist. Lots of different schools. What unites them and distinguishes them from many other socialists is that total rejection of the state.
And libertarian socialism.
That term often describes socialists who share anarchism's anti-statism. They want socialist goals ending exploitation, worker control, but achieved through decentralized, voluntary means, not the state. Think Bakunin, Emma Goldman, maybe Benjamin Tucker.
So, very different from state-centric approaches. What about democratic socialism?
Democratic socialists aim for an economy based on economic democracy run by and for the working class, but they generally seek to achieve this through democratic means, elections, reforms, gradual evolution within the existing political system.
And how does social democracy relate to that?
It's very closely related. Many social democrats call themselves socialists. Historically, social democracy has had two main tendencies. One aimed to gradually bring about full democratic socialism.
And the other?
The other, more common perhaps in the late 20th century, focused on building a strong welfare state, supporting unions, providing public services, and regulating capitalism within a liberal democracy, creating a mixed economy.
That's the model often seen in Scandinavia and Western Europe.
Exactly, sometimes called hybrid economics. And some studies suggest these societies tend to have higher levels of happiness and health. There's also ethical or liberal socialism, drawing on thinkers like Mill or Dewey, which emphasizes individual liberty alongside social justice.
Then the opposite end, authoritarian socialism.
Right, or socialism from above. This combines socialist economics, state ownership, planning with a rejection of political democracy. Single-party rule, limited freedoms, the Soviet Union, Maoist China, Cuba are often cited as examples.
And Leninism fits in here.
Leninism is a specific strand. It incorporates ideas from Blanquism, the notion of a small, secret group carrying out the revolution. It combines Marx with Lenin's ideas on imperialism, democratic centralism within the party, the need for a vanguard party to lead, and that principle, he who does not work, neither shall he eat.
There was that distinction by Hal Draper. Socialism from above versus from below.
Yes, a really useful distinction. Above is socialism implemented by an elite, by the state. Below emphasizes democratic control, mass movements of working people. Draper argued Marx and Engels were actually proponents of socialism from below and were wary of anything leading to authoritarianism.
So contrasting revolutionary democratic socialism with things like Stalinism.
Exactly.
Could we elaborate a bit more on libertarian socialism, its core tenets?
Sure. It really emphasizes rejecting state ownership and control. Instead, it favors direct worker self-management of workplaces and organizing society through decentralized voluntary associations or federations.
So getting rid of hierarchy not just in government but in the economy too.
Precisely. Ending authority, exploitation, hierarchy in all spheres. It's about maximizing individual freedom through cooperation and mutual aid, not state direction. Gaston Laval described it as a society coordinated enough to function but flexible enough for autonomy.
Does it share anything with libertarian capitalism?
An interesting point. They share a deep suspicion of state power interfering with individual freedoms, thought, expression, lifestyle. But obviously, they diverge massively on economics and property.
Emma Goldman's vision seems relevant here.
Absolutely. Her idea of anarchism as liberation from religion, property, and government, aiming for a social order where people freely group together to produce and share wealth and necessities. It's seen by proponents as a continuous struggle against all forms of domination.
And this anti-state socialism isn't new.
Not at all.
I knew.
It has deep roots, predating Bolshevism. Figures like Benjamin Tucker called themselves anarchistic socialists. Even early communal experiments in the U.S. drew on these ideas.
What about religious forms of socialism?
Yes, that exists too. Christian socialism tries to blend Christian teachings with socialist ideals. Islamic socialism often draws on Quranic principles of equality and social welfare, sometimes looking back to the early Medina state as a model. Often it's intertwined with anti-imperialism and Arab nationalism.
And connections to other social movements. Feminism, LGBTQ plus rights.
Strong connections. Many socialist feminists see capitalism and patriarchy as interlinked systems of oppression. And historically, many socialists have been strong advocates for LGBTQ plus rights, fighting against discrimination.
Okay, one more political current.
Right.
Syndicalism, what's its focus?
Syndicalism centers everything on industrial trade unions. It rejects traditional politics, parliaments, state socialism. The strategy is direct action by workers, primarily through their unions.
Well, it's the ultimate goal.
To achieve a socialist economy run directly by federated workers' unions, the syndicates. The general strike is often seen as the key revolutionary tactic.
Are there different types?
Yes, some Marxist currents, like Dillianism, incorporate syndicalist ideas. And then there's anarcho-syndicalism, which sees the unions not just as fighting tools, but as the basis for the future stateless socialist society. The CNT in Spain is the classic example. There's still an international federation, the IWA.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. Finally, how is socialism viewed today? And what are the main criticisms?
Views are incredibly polarized, as you can imagine, very diverse, strongly held opinions.
What are some common criticisms?
A frequent one is that the focus on equality might stifle individual differences, creativity, initiative, and that creating a truly equal society would require a huge amount of state coercion, crushing liberty.
Milton Friedman's argument.
Right. He argued that concentrating economic power in the state by eliminating private enterprise inevitably concentrates coercive power, too, making political leaders potentially more dangerous than capitalists.
And the historical argument from the right.
Critics often point to the mass killings and repression under communist regimes, Stalin's purges, Mao's Great Leap Forward, Cambodia as proof that socialism inevitably leads to tyranny and violence, a fundamental indictment of the whole idea.
How do socialists respond to that?
The counter-argument is usually that those horrors were due to specific authoritarian regimes, specific leaders, specific historical circumstances, war, civil war, external threats, not something inherent in the idea of social ownership or equality itself. They might also point to violence and deaths that occurred under capitalist systems through colonialism or in anti-communist regimes backed by capitalist powers. It's a deeply contentious historical debate.
So, wrapping this up, it's clear socialism isn't one single thing.
Not at all. The core idea might be social ownership, but how that's interpreted, the economic models proposed, the political strategies, it's incredibly diverse. From central planning to decentralized cooperatives, from revolutionary parties to democratic reforms, from state control to anarchism.
We've seen the different strands, democratic, libertarian, authoritarian, market-based, and the ongoing arguments and criticisms.
It really highlights the complexity of trying to build a society that's both fair and efficient, balancing collective well-being with individual freedom.
Which leads us to a final thought for you, the listener. Given this huge diversity, we've explored all the different forms, the historical impacts, the competing ideas within socialism. What fundamental values and maybe what societal structures do you think are truly essential for creating a just and equitable world?
Something to chew on. It's a question that doesn't really have easy answers, does it? Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're zooming in on something that might seem like just a tiny detail on the sun's sunspots, those temporary dark marks. They actually hold a surprising amount of information about our star.
They really do. And, while they look like just spots on the surface, the photosphere, they're really signs of disturbances that go much deeper through the whole solar atmosphere. What's really amazing, actually, is that some of the really big ones, you can sometimes even see them from Earth. No telescope needed. Though, obviously, you need to know what you're doing and be incredibly careful about safety.
Absolutely. Safety first, always with the sun. Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. What's really causing these dark areas? It's more than just like a shadow, right?
Oh, much more. The darkness, it really just means it's cooler there, locally cooler. Think of it like this. You have these really intense magnetic fields bubbling up from inside the sun. And they act sort of like a plug, They stop the normal flow of heat convections. So less energy gets to that patch surface, it cools down, and that's why it looks dark compared to the super hot surroundings.
Ah, okay, so magnetism is the key. That makes sense. And these spots, they usually show up in pairs, don't they?
Precisely. Almost always. They pop up in what we call active regions and, yeah, typically as a pairs. And these pairs have opposite magnetic polarities, like the north and south ends of a bar magnet.
Okay, got it. So we're getting a handle on the basics here. But this deep dive, it isn't just about spotting dark patches, is it? What's our sort of mission today?
Well, our goal is to really get into the whole picture of sunspots. We want to look at their history. People have been seeing these for a long time. Then unravel the physics, how they actually work, explore how they're tied into the sun's big activity cycle, and maybe even touch on how they might affect things beyond the sun itself.
Sounds like a proper deep dive. And yeah, to do that, we've gathered quite a bit of info, everything from ancient writings to, well, the latest solar science. So let's start with that history. When did people first notice these things? It can't be just since telescopes, surely.
Oh, absolutely not. Way, way before telescopes. The earliest sort of hints go back millennia. You can find mentions in the ancient Chinese I Ching that text was finalized before 800 BC talking about small dark things on the sun. They use words like dew and May.
Wow, before 800 BC. That's incredible. So the Chinese were observing these really early. What a long history.
It really is. And the first deliberate recorded observation, also from China, an astronomer named Goldie, around 364 BC, mentioned one in his star catalog. And get this, by 28 BC, Chinese astronomers were routinely noting sunspots in the official imperial records. Talk about dedication.
That's amazing. What about over in the West? Were they seeing them too back then?
Well, the first really clear mention in Western texts seems to be around 300 BC, from Theophrastus, the Greek scholar, student of Plato and Aristotle. So yeah, there was awareness, maybe just not documented quite as systematically as in China early on. It really puts things in perspective.
Definitely. And when did we go from just seeing them to actually, drawing them? That feels like a big step towards studying them properly.
Right. The earliest drawings we actually have are from an English monk, John of Worcester, December 1128. So we have a visual record from back then, just naked eye stuff. Pretty cool piece of history.
Fascinating. Okay, then the telescope arrives. Big game changer, I assume.
Oh, huge.
Right.
Completely revolutionized things. The first telescopic sighting we know of was by an Englishman, Thomas Harriot, December 1610. He wrote it in his notebooks. Then, just a few months later, March 1611, Johannes and David Fabricius, Frisian astronomers, they observed them too and actually published first, though their work got a bit overshadowed because Christoph Scheiner and, of course, Galilei made their own independent observations and publications around 1612. So suddenly, within just a couple of years, our view of the sun got way more detailed.
Galileo. Seems like he was involved in everything back then.
He was definitely a key figure. And, we should also mention Johannes Hevelius, a really important astronomer in the 17th century. He meticulously recorded 19 sunspot groups during a really quiet time for the sun, the start of the Maunder minimum between 1653 and 1679. His records are, well, invaluable.
The Maunder minimum. Right. We definitely need to circle back to that when we talk about the cycles. But before we jump too far ahead, William Herschel, discoverer of Uranus. I remember reading he had some interesting thoughts on sunspots.
He did. Early 19th century, Herschel was one of the first to really suggest a link between sunspots and Earth's temperature.
Mm-hmm.
He even thought maybe certain types of sunspots might mean more heat from the sun. And he noticed fewer spots between 1795 and 1800 and tried to connect that to high wheat prices in England, an early attempt to link solar stuff to Earth.
Fewer sunspots, higher food prices. Wow, that's quite a direct link he was proposing.
Yeah, he thought so. But the president of the Royal Society at the time pointed out that, well, maybe monetary inflation was a better explanation for the wheat prices. And later on, scientists tried to find a real statistical link, people like Carrington and Poynting, but no luck. Modern analysis confirms it too. There's no statistically significant connection there.
It was a cool idea, but just didn't pan out. Shows how tricky these links can be.
Okay, right. So a long and really fascinating history. Let's dive into the actual physics now.
Mm-hmm.
We mentioned magnetic fields, but what are they actually like structurally?
Well, they have a pretty distinct structure. Typically, you've got the really dark center part. That's the umbra. That's where the magnetic field is strongest and points pretty much straight up vertically out of the surface, the photosphere. And then around that, you have a brighter sort of filamentary region. That's the penumbra.
And the magnetic field's different in the penumbra, is that right? Exactly. It's made of these long radial filaments, and the magnetic field there is more tilted, more horizontal compared to the umbra. And in big sunspot groups, you can even get multiple umbras sharing one big penumbra. It gets quite complex.
No, you said the temperature difference makes them look dark. How big is that difference?
It's pretty significant. The umbra is maybe 3,000 to 4,500 Kelvin, whereas the photosphere around it was much hotter, around 5,780 Kelvin. That contrast makes them look black, but they aren't really. I mean, if you could somehow isolate a sunspot, take it away from the bright background, it would actually shine brighter than the full moon, a sort of crimson-orange color. It just shows how incredibly bright the rest of the sun's surface is.
That's amazing. Brighter than the moon. Wow. What about these light bridges I've heard mentioned? What are those?
Ah, right. Light bridges. They're these brighter, kind of narrow features you sometimes see crossing the umbra, usually when a spot is forming or breaking up. And what's interesting is studies show the magnetic field in these bridges is weaker and more tilted than in the main umbra, at least lower down. Higher up, the fields tend to blend together more. And it looks like gas pressure is more dominant than magnetic pressure in these bridges, maybe even some convection starting up again, just like the magnetic field's grip is weakening a bit right there.
Huh. Interesting detail. Okay, so we know what they look like. How long do they stick around? What's their typical life story?
Well, a single individual spot might last just a few days, or it could hang around for months. But when they're part of those bigger active regions, the whole group can persist for weeks, maybe even months. And they change size, too. They can be tiny, like 16 kilometers across, think small city size. Or they can be absolutely enormous, up to 160,000 kilometers. That's bigger than Jupiter, almost, way bigger than Earth. The scale is just mind-blowing.
Truly staggering. And how do they actually form? Where did they come from?
Right, the formation. Well, the details are still being researched, but the main idea is they're basically the tips of huge magnetic flux tubes. Imagine these massive bundles of magnetic field lines deep inside the sun, in the convection zone. They get twisted up by the sun's rotation and become buoyant. So they rise up towards the surface and eventually sort of poke through the photosphere. And that's where we see the sunspot, in those active regions.
So these intense magnetic ropes are essentially breaching the surface.
Exactly. And it's the sheer strength of that magnetic field that messes with the convection. That boiling motion that brings heat up. The strong field inhibits it, blocks the energy flow. So that spot cools down, looks darker. Often they start as just small, dark dots, no penumbra yet. We call those solar pores, like baby sunspots.
And the penumbra comes later as they grow.
Yeah, as these pores get bigger, maybe move together, if they reach about, say, 3,500 kilometers across, then the penumbra usually starts to form around them. That's when you get a mature sunspot.
Okay, so they form, live their life, then they must decay, right? How does that happen? You mentioned the magnetic field should naturally want to spread out.
That's a really sharp point. Yeah, magnetic pressure should make them dissipate fairly quickly. So the fact they last for days or weeks was a bit of a puzzle. But observations, especially from the SOHO spacecraft, have given us clues. Using a technique called helioseismology, basically using sound waves to see inside the sun. Scientists mapped the area underneath sunspots, and they found these powerful downdrafts, sort of swirling vortex-like motions right below the spot. It seems these flows actively hold the magnetic field together, stopping it from spreading out too fast. Like there's an engine underneath keeping it going.
Wow, so there's an active process keeping them stable. That adds another layer, doesn't it? Okay, we absolutely have to talk about the solar cycle. That roughly 11-year rhythm. How do sunspots fit into that?
They're basically the main indicator of the solar cycle. Over about 11 years, it varies a bit. The number of sunspots we see goes up and then down. Peak activity, lots of spots. That's solar maximum. Low activity, few spots, solar minimum. And this cycle affects pretty much everything else the sun does. Flares, eruptions, the whole lot. It's all driven by the sun's global magnetic field, which actually flips its polarity, its north and south, every cycle.
And I remember reading the location changes, too. They start far from the equator and move closer.
Absolutely correct. That's called Spur's law. Early in a cycle, spots pop up at higher latitudes, maybe 30, 40 degrees north or south. Then as the cycle goes on, towards maximum and beyond, new spots appear closer and closer to the equator. Near solar minimum, you can actually see spots from the old cycle near the equator and spots from the new cycle starting up at high latitudes at the same time. It's a really clear pattern.
And there's a way to measure this activity, right? The Wolf number.
Yeah, the Wolf number. It's a standard index, counts both individual spots and groups of spots, gives us a single number for the overall activity level. And we number these cycles, starting back in the 1750s. So we have a pretty long record now.
And that link to magnetic fields, George Ellery Hale made a huge discovery there, didn't he? Early 20th century.
Oh, massive. 1908. Hale was the one who definitively showed that sunspots are intensely magnetic regions, a groundbreaking discovery. And he also proposed that maybe the real cycle is 22 years long, not 11, because it takes 22 years for the magnetic field to flip and then flip back to its original orientation. Two 11-year cycles make one full magnetic cycle. Later, Horace Babcock developed what we call the Babcock model, which explains Spurrer's law and how the sun's rotation twists up those magnetic fields to create the whole cycle.
So the sun spinning is really turning up this magnetic activity. It's quite an intricate dance. Now, are these 11-year cycles perfectly regular, or do we see longer trends over centuries?
Oh, definitely longer trends. Sunspot numbers vary quite a bit over decades, centuries, even millennia. For example, there was a period, roughly 1900 to 1958, called the modern maximum. Just generally higher peaks in activity during those cycles. But since then, the trend in peak activity has been mostly, well, downwards. And interestingly, some studies suggest the sun during that modern maximum was about as active as it had been for something like 8,000 years before. Puts our times in perspective.
That really does give a long view. And how does this longer-term activity relate to the sun's energy output, its brightness?
Well, since we started measuring accurately from space around 1979, we've seen a pretty clear link. More sunspots generally mean slightly higher total solar irradiance than the sun's total energy output. But the change over the 11-year cycle is actually quite small, only about 0.1% variation in the total energy. Subtle but measurable.
Okay, so more spots, fractionally more energy. Seems like a delicate balance. Now, fast forward to today. How do scientists actually watch these things now, with all our fancy tech?
We have an amazing toolkit now, both telescopes on the ground and instruments in space. They use special filters, sometimes projection techniques so people can view safely. High-res filtered cameras give incredible images. And then there are instruments like spectroscopes, spectrohelioscopes. They break down the light to tell us about temperature, magnetic fields, what the spots are made of. We could even create artificial eclipses using coronagraphs to see spots right at the sun's edge.
And what about for us amateurs? Can we see them safely from, the backyard?
Yes, absolutely. But safety is non-negotiable. Never, ever look directly at the sun without proper protection. It causes permanent eye damage fast. Safe ways include projecting the image, use a telescope or binoculars to project the sun's image onto a white card, indirect viewing, or use specially designed solar filters. Filters made specifically for telescopes or binoculars that block almost all the harmful light and heat. Some people use a #14 welder's glass for very brief naked eye checks, but honestly, proper astronomical solar filters are much safer and better. Always prioritize safety.
Good advice. Okay, moving beyond just understanding the sun. Do sunspots have practical implications for us here on Earth? I know space weather comes up a lot.
Definitely. Sunspots are tied to things like solar flares and coronal mass ejections, CMEs, big bursts of energy and plasma. So tracking where sunspots are, how complex they are, helps us forecast space weather. When are we likely to get one of these big events? Because those events can seriously mess with Earth's magnetic field, our atmosphere, affecting satellites, radio communications, even power grids sometimes.
So when amateur radio operators get excited about lots of sunspots, there's a real reason for that.
Exactly. High sunspot activity usually means the Earth's ionosphere gets more energized, more ionized, and that layer is what bounces radio waves around the planet. So during solar maximum, high-frequency radio signals travel much, much further. You can get worldwide communication on bands that are normally just local, line of sight. It's a direct link between the sunspots and our technology.
That's a really cool practical effect. Now, what about the more debated links, sunspots and climate? We mentioned Herschel's early idea. Has that connection held up?
Well, it's evolved a lot. That Maunder minimum, the time with very few spots that coincided with the Little Ice Age in Europe, that was the classic example. But more detailed climate studies using tree rings, ice cores, all sorts of proxy data show the cooling actually started before the Maunder minimum and lasted after it. And climate models now point much more strongly towards volcanoes. Lots of volcanic eruptions back then, putting aerosols into the atmosphere, reflecting sunlight. That seems to be the main driver of the Little Ice Age.
Okay, so the Maunder minimum link might be more correlation, less direct cause.
That's the general consensus now, yeah. Sunspots do slightly affect the sun's total energy output, that 0.1% variation we mentioned. But other things linked to the cycle, like bright areas called faculae, also play a role. It's complex. And figuring out long-term trends in the sun's total output, the total solar irradiance, or TSI, is really hard because keeping instruments perfectly calibrated in space for decades is tricky. In fact, some recent work suggests the TSI during the Maunder minimum might not have been that much lower than today, maybe even similar. though the uncertainties are still pretty big. So yeah, the direct climate impact of sunspots themselves seems pretty subtle, more nuanced than people first thought.
Right, a much more complex picture than just fewer spots equals colder. Okay, one last area before we wrap up star spots. Are these just sunspots on other stars?
Essentially, yes. They're the stellar equivalent. We see similar dark spots, sometimes even bright spots, on the surfaces of lots of other stars. Way back in 1947, people suggested star spots could explain why some red dwarf stars vary in brightness periodically, though our sun isn't unique in having them.
But how on earth do we see spots on stars light years away? That sounds incredibly difficult.
It is challenging, but modern techniques are amazing. One main way is photometry, just measuring tiny dips in a star's brightness as a big spot rotates across its face into our view. We also use spectroscopy. The light from the spot is cooler, so it changes the star's overall spectrum slightly. And we can use the Zeeman effect, how magnetic fields split spectral lines, to actually detect the magnetic fields in those spots. There's also Doppler imaging, a really clever technique that uses the star's rotation to build up maps of where spots are on its surface. From all this, we can figure out sizes, temperatures, how they're distributed, even if they have cycles like our sun, sometimes very different cycles. For instance, back in 1999, they found this enormous cool spot on a giant star called XX Trianguli, much bigger and cooler relative to its star than our sunspots are. It's incredible what we can figure out.
Truly amazing that we can tease out that kind of detail from so far away. It really shows these magnetic phenomena are universal, doesn't it?
It really does. And it highlights why studying our sun up close is so important. It's our local laboratory for understanding stars everywhere.
Well, this has been a really fantastic deep dive. Sunspots, they're clearly so much more than just dark marks on the sun, aren't they? They're windows into intense magnetic activity tied directly to that 11-year cycle, with this incredibly long history of observation. And even if the climate link is subtle, their effect on space weather, on radio, that's very real. What started as just noticing dark patches has become this key tool for understanding magnetism on our star and others far away. That's quite a journey.
It absolutely is. From those ancient Chinese astronomers carefully noting little shadows to space telescopes mapping the magnetic chaos underneath them today. Sunspots have kept us watching and learning for millennia. They're a great reminder that sometimes the smallest looking features can tell us the biggest stories about how the universe works.
Couldn't agree more. And on that note, here's something for you, our listeners, to think about. Given this long story of sunspots and all the research still uncovering their complexities and effects, what other seemingly small or subtle things out there in the cosmos might be holding huge secrets? Secrets about the universe and maybe even its influence on us that we're only just starting to glimpse. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a big one, capitalism.
Mhm.
It's a word you hear constantly, like shapes how we live, but pinning down exactly what it is can feel, well, surprisingly tricky.
Absolutely. And for this exploration, we're digging into the Wikipedia entry on capitalism, a really comprehensive overview you, our listener, kindly pointed us towards. It covers a lot of ground,
Yeah.
from the very beginnings of the idea right through to the various criticisms it faces today.
Okay, let's unpack this straight away because the first thing that strikes you is, well, the lack of a solid, universally agreed upon definition.
Right.
Our source highlights this debate. Is capitalism the defining feature of an entire society? Or is it just, a set of economic tools and practices?
And what's fascinating about this definitional ambiguity is that even societies ideologically opposed to capitalism, well, arguments have been made that they exhibited some of its core characteristics.
Like the Soviet Union, you mean?
Think about the Soviet Union, for example. Yeah. The pressure to meet production quotas could arguably be seen as a form of capital accumulation, just state-driven. It makes you wonder if capitalism is maybe more of a spectrum than some kind of strict category.
Right. It suggests the term might be more of a rhetorical shorthand sometimes, rather than a precise analytical tool, especially in mainstream economics, where you might see discussions of markets and firms without, the explicit label of capitalism. Here's where it gets really interesting. Why might even proponents of these systems shy away from using the word capitalism itself?
That's a really good question.
Mhm.
The source does touch on the idea that capitalism was largely a term coined by its critics.
Ah, okay.
So perhaps that historical baggage,
Mm-hmm.
the inherent critical perspective, makes some hesitant to embrace it as a neutral descriptor, even if they advocate for many of the system's features.
Right.
And the notion that it might overemphasize capital as some sort of self-propelling force,
Mm-hmm.
rather than focusing on individual economic actions, that's also something to consider.
So, okay, to give us a foundation for this dive, let's maybe work with a definition offered by our source. Capitalism as an economic system built on the private ownership of the means of production,
Mhm.
with profit as the primary driver.
And breaking that down, the source outlines several key elements that tend to go hand in hand with this. Things like um, private property rights,
Right.
the pursuit of profit, the ongoing accumulation of capital, markets where competition plays a significant role,
Uh-huh.
the process of turning goods and services and even labor into commodities for sale,
Commodification.
yeah, the prevalence of wage labor,
Mm-hmm.
and a strong emphasis on innovation and, overall economic expansion.
Okay.
And it's also worth remembering, as the source points out, that this pursuit of growth isn't always like a straight line.
No.
Capitalist economies tend to experience cycles of boom and bust, growth and recession.
Yeah, the business cycles. Okay, now let's step back a bit and look at where the actual term capitalism came from. Interestingly, the word capitalist, referring to someone who owns capital that actually predates capitalism by quite a bit. It shows up in the mid-17th century.
It's like the actor came before the play was written.
Exactly.
And tracing the root of capital itself is, well, quite revealing. It comes from the Latin caput, meaning head,
Head. Okay.
which then evolved to refer to movable property. Think of words like chattel
Right.
or even cattle.
Ah, right. Movable assets.
Yeah. By the 12th and 13th centuries, its meaning had broadened further to include funds, merchandise, money that could generate interest. You can see this gradual shift towards a more financial understanding.
So the idea of capital is something that can be owned and can, grow. It has a long history.
Definitely.
Our source notes that the term capitalists started appearing in different languages in the 17th and 18th centuries. We see figures like Hamilton, Ricardo, Coleridge using it in their writings late 18th, early 19th centuries.
But the emergence of capitalism as a way to describe a whole economic system that really gained traction in the mid-19th century with thinkers like Louis Blanc and Proudhon.
Oh.
They often used it to highlight the idea of capital being concentrated and controlled by, a certain segment of society.
And of course, Karl Marx, though he more often used the phrase capitalist mode of production in Das Kapital.
Right.
His analysis of capital and its role in shaping society was absolutely fundamental to how we think about these economic structures.
It's a crucial point, as the source mentions, that because capitalism was largely popularized by its critics, some argue it carries an inherent negative bias. Or maybe it's even a bit of a misnomer.
How so?
Well, they suggest it puts too much emphasis on capital, as if it's some independent, self-regulating entity, potentially overlooking the role of, say, individual initiative and market dynamics.
That's interesting. It's funny that the first recorded use of capitalism in English, according to the OED in 1854, it just meant having ownership of capital, like a simple description.
Yeah, it seems the term started out pretty neutral and then evolved into this label for an entire economic and social order, often with those critical undertones attached.
Our source also gives us a helpful list of alternative terms often used for capitalism, doesn't it?
It does. Things like economic liberalism, free enterprise, market economy, laissez-faire. Recognizing these different labels can give you a broader understanding of the various facets and, ideological angles associated with this system.
Right. Okay, let's delve into the historical development then. Our source outlines some key stages, starting with agrarianism in 16th century England. What were the crucial shifts happening back then?
Well, this period saw a pretty significant departure from the old feudal agricultural system.
Okay.
Land ownership became more concentrated, wage labor started to become more common, and there was increasing pressure to boost agricultural productivity, not just for local use, but for profit.
Ah, for the market.
Exactly. With rents being increasingly determined by market conditions, it was really a move towards land itself being treated as a form of capital.
Got it. Following that, we move into the era of mercantilism, right? 16th to 18th centuries. This was all about trade for profit, heavily linked to the expansion of European powers and their colonies. How did this differ from what came before?
Well, while it didn't always rely on fully, let's say, capitalist production methods back home, mercantilism saw the rise of merchant capitalism as a dominant force.
Merchant capitalism, okay.
Nation-states heavily controlled trade through subsidies, monopolies like the English and Dutch East India companies.
Famous examples.
And the overarching goal was always maintaining a positive balance of trade, exporting more than importing to accumulate wealth like gold and silver. The state played a very, very active role in shaping economic activity.
Then we hit the Industrial Revolution starting mid-18th century. This feels like a real turning point.
Yeah.
What were the key changes there?
Oh, absolutely. A massive shift. This era saw industrialists, the people who owned and ran factories, becoming more central than the merchants. The factory system emerged with its division of labor, mass production. And interestingly, Britain, which had been a leading mercantilist power, began to move away from those protectionist policies.
Why was that?
Well, they were influenced by thinkers advocating for free trade, like Cobden and Bright, repealing things like the Corn Laws and Navigation Acts. It marked a shift towards a more market-oriented approach.
Okay, and that brings us roughly to modernity, from the 19th century up to today. What are the defining characteristics of this latest phase?
Well, globalization has been a massive factor, obviously, spreading capitalist practices across the globe. The 19th century was largely characterized by relatively unregulated markets. Laissez-faire was kind of the dominant idea.
Right.
However, the period after World War II saw a rise in government intervention, often termed Keynesianism, trying to manage economic cycles, smooth things out.
Okay.
Then from the 1980s onwards, there's been a trend back towards deregulation and a greater emphasis on free markets, often labeled neoliberalism.
Right, Reagan and Thatcher era thinking.
Exactly. And of course, the collapse of centrally planned economies in the late 20th century really cemented the dominance of capitalism globally. Plus, we've seen the growth of a substantial managerial class within corporations.
Now, the relationship between capitalism and democracy, and that's something that's constantly debated, isn't it?
Oh, endlessly.
Our source mentions that in 19th century Britain, the expansion of who could vote happened alongside the growth of capitalism. Does that suggest like a natural connection?
Well, while that historical parallel is interesting, it's really crucial to remember, as our source points out, that capitalism has existed under a wide variety of political systems.
Yeah.
Not just liberal democracies. Think of authoritarian regimes that have embraced capitalist economic models.
Sure.
The democratic peace theory, the idea that democracies tend not to fight each other, that might be more about shared political norms or stability than simply, being capitalist.
However, our source also notes arguments for a more supportive relationship, right?
Yes, there are theories suggesting that economic growth, which capitalism often spurs, can lead to a larger middle class, and that middle class, in turn, can provide support for democratic institutions. Also, a decentralized market economy can potentially act as a counterbalance to excessive state power.
And then you have thinkers like Hayek and Friedman.
Right, who famously argued that economic freedom, which they saw as inherent to capitalism, is actually a necessary condition for political freedom.
Okay.
They believe that a free market is the most effective and, importantly, the least coercive way to organize economic activity.
But then we have voices like Piketty, whose work is mentioned in our source, who raise concerns about the potential for capitalism to generate significant inequality, which could ultimately undermine democratic stability. And as our source reminds us, there are clear examples of capitalist states thriving under authoritarian rule: Singapore, China, Chile under Pinochet.
Exactly. It really complicates any straightforward link between the two systems.
It's also worth noting, as the source does, that while Marx is often associated with the term capitalism, he primarily used capitalist mode of production.
That's right.
And in more recent times, some who advocate for the system have preferred terms like free enterprise, perhaps to sidestep some of that historical and critical baggage we talked about.
Possibly, yeah. It avoids some loaded connotations.
Okay, let's get down to the core components then.
Yeah.
What are the key characteristics of capitalism, according to our source? The first one mentioned is capital accumulation. What does that really entail?
At its heart, capital accumulation is the process where profit isn't just, consumed or distributed,
Right.
but is reinvested back into production with the goal of generating even more profit. It's this continuous cycle that really distinguishes capitalism from, say, more traditional economic systems focused on direct consumption or household production.
And closely linked to that is commodity production, right?
Exactly. In capitalist systems, goods and services are primarily produced not for their direct use value, but for their exchange value on the market. The aim is to maximize what they can be sold for.
And this exchange, as the source notes, often happens through contracts and crucially includes wage labor.
Yes, wage labor is a defining feature. It's where individuals sell their ability to work their labor power in exchange for wages or salaries.
Okay.
This creates a labor market, and the product of that labor typically becomes the property of the employer, the one who owns the means of production.
A fundamental element is, of course, the private ownership of the means of production itself.
Absolutely fundamental. The tools, factories, land, other resources needed to produce goods and services are privately owned.
Right.
And the owners have the right to control their use and any profits generated. Alongside this is the investment of money with the explicit intention of making a profit.
The price mechanism is mentioned as a key characteristic. How does that work in allocating resources? What does the source say there?
The price mechanism is essentially the system where supply and demand interact to determine the prices of goods and services. These prices then act as signals, indicating where resources are most in demand and potentially most profitable to employ, thus guiding their allocation across the economy. The theory, at least, is that this leads to economic efficiency, maximizing the overall value created.
Our source also points to the freedom of capitalists. What does that encompass exactly?
It refers generally to the autonomy of business owners and investors to make decisions in their own self-interest regarding production, investment, trade, obviously, within the legal framework. And underpinning this is the idea of capital being supplied by those private owners or perhaps shareholders.
The market itself plays a dominant role, though. As you said, the level of government involvement can vary quite a bit.
Precisely. The market is the primary arena for economic activity, but the degree to which it's regulated differs massively. You have so-called free markets with minimal intervention,
Right.
mixed economies with a blend of market activity and government oversight or provision, and even state capitalism, where the government plays a very significant direct role in the economy.
And competition.
Competition within these markets is generally seen as a driver of innovation and better prices for consumers. But the source also acknowledges the dangers of monopolies and cartels.
Sure.
And the need for regulations like antitrust laws. The Sherman Act is mentioned to prevent anti-competitive practices.
We've touched on wage labor, but it's worth maybe reiterating its significance as a specific kind of economic relationship.
Yeah, it's really the fundamental socio-economic relationship in capitalism, where a significant portion, usually the majority of the population, earns their living by selling their labor power on the market.
And the profit motive, the desire to earn profit, that's often seen as the engine driving this whole system, isn't it?
Indeed. The pursuit of profit is considered a primary motivator for economic activity. Theoretically, it leads to efficient resource allocation as businesses strive to produce goods and services that consumers demand at prices they're willing to pay.
But there are critiques of that.
Oh, certainly. The source also mentioned the socialist critique, for instance, which questions whether this relentless focus on profit always aligns with broader societal well-being or needs.
Private property rights are absolutely central. Why are they considered so crucial in a capitalist system, according to the source?
Well, our source notes, referencing the work of Hernando de Soto, that clearly defined and legally protected private property rights are seen as essential for transforming assets into usable capital.
How so?
They allow assets to be used as collateral for loans, for investment, fostering economic growth. However, the source also reminds us of the Marxist perspective on how the establishment of these rights historically involved processes like the enclosure movements, which separated people from their traditional means of subsistence, what Marx called primitive accumulation.
Right.
And it's important to remember, private property rights aren't absolute. Governments can, for example, exercise eminent domain for public use.
Good point. Market competition is another key aspect. How does that contribute to the system?
Competition among businesses, rivalry for profit, market share, sales, is seen as a vital force.
Okay.
Our source mentions Adam Smith's view on how this rivalry drives innovation, efficiency, and ultimately lower prices for consumers. The freedom for businesses to enter and exit markets easily is also crucial for this competitive dynamic to function effectively.
Finally, our source mentions economic growth as a characteristic tendency, though, as you said earlier, it's not always smooth sailing.
That's right. Capitalist economies tend to exhibit this inherent drive towards increasing production, investment, and overall economic output, often measured by things like GDP per capita. However, this growth is typically punctuated by the cyclical nature of the economy, with those periods of expansion followed by contractions or recessions.
And looking at capitalism as a mode of production.
As a mode of production, yeah. It's
Yeah.
defined by that private ownership of the means of production, the extraction of surplus value from labor, the prevalence of wage labor, and market-based exchange.
How does that contrast with, say, feudalism?
Well, feudalism was characterized more by production for direct use, with the factors of production largely owned or controlled by a ruling class, and labor tied to the land through obligations rather than wages. In capitalism, capital accumulation becomes the defining economic rationality,
Okay.
and capitalism is considered dominant when most incomes and products stem primarily from capitalist activity. Though, of course, most modern economies are mixed, balancing the free market with state provision and regulation.
Even in capitalist systems, the government still clearly has a role to play. What does our source highlight in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely. The source points out that governments in capitalist economies typically regulate things like service standards, they finance certain public programs, and they use macroeconomic tools like interest rates
Right.
to try and manage broader economic conditions, aiming to control inflation or unemployment.
Now, a foundational concept that underpins how these markets operate is supply and demand.
Yeah.
Can you give us a quick rundown of that basic model as presented in our source?
Sure. In essence, supply and demand is a microeconomic model that explains how prices are determined in a market.
Okay.
It posits that the price of a good or service will tend to settle at a point where the quantity that producers are willing to supply at that price equals the quantity that consumers are willing to buy at that price. That's the market equilibrium.
And from this basic idea, we get the four fundamental laws of supply and demand, as our source describes them. What are the key takeaways there?
Well, these laws describe how shifts in either the supply of a product or the demand for it will affect the equilibrium price and quantity.
For example?
For example, an increase in demand, assuming everything else stays the same, will tend to lead to a higher price and a greater quantity sold. Conversely, an increase in supply, again, all else equal, will typically result in a lower price and a greater quantity sold. Simple shifts in the curves.
Our source also differentiates between a supply schedule and a demand schedule. What's the difference there?
Right. The supply schedule is just a table or a graph, a curve, that shows the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity producers are willing and able to supply at each price. Generally, higher price, higher quantity supplied.
Okay.
The demand schedule, on the other hand, shows the relationship between price and the quantity consumers are willing and able to purchase. This typically slopes downward
Why downward?
because as the price goes down, the quantity demanded tends to go up. That's the law of demand, often linked to the concept of marginal utility, the idea that the additional satisfaction you get from consuming one more unit tends to decrease.
And where these two schedules or curves intersect is the equilibrium point, right?
Exactly. That's the point of balance, where the forces of supply and demand are, well, in equilibrium. The market price and the quantity traded tend to stabilize around that point, at least theoretically.
And partial equilibrium.
The source also mentions partial equilibrium, which is just a way of analyzing equilibrium in one specific market while kind of holding other related markets constant and simplifying the analysis.
It's interesting that the source traces the discussion of supply and demand back quite a ways. It's not a new idea.
Not at all.
Yeah.
The underlying concepts were discussed by scholars centuries ago. The source mentions early Muslim thinkers like Ibn Taymiyyah.
Wow.
Later, figures like John Locke and David Ricardo laid out more rigorous frameworks. And it was Fleming Jenkin who is credited with the first graphical representation of supply and demand curves,
Okay.
which was then further developed and really popularized by Alfred Marshall in his economic texts.
Got it. So capitalism isn't a monolith. It's not one size fits all. Our source outlines various types. Can you give us a brief overview of some of the key distinctions mentioned?
Certainly. Advanced capitalism generally refers to highly developed economies with deeply entrenched capitalist institutions, complex financial systems, large corporations. Corporate capitalism is characterized specifically by the dominance of those large hierarchical corporations. In finance capitalism, financial institutions, banks, investment funds, stock markets play a particularly prominent, maybe even dominant role in capital accumulation and the overall economy.
Right.
Free market capitalism, as the name suggests, emphasizes minimal government intervention, laissez-faire principles.
And there are other variations as well, right? Ones with more state involvement.
Yes, mercantile capitalism, as we discussed earlier, involves significant state intervention to promote national trade interests.
Okay.
Then you have models like the social market economy, often associated with Germany, or welfare capitalism, common in Nordic countries, which combine a market economy with extensive social safety nets and regulations.
Right.
State capitalism sees the state playing a major economic role, either through direct ownership of enterprises or heavy control and direction. Political capitalism is a term sometimes used to describe situations where economic opportunities and profit-making are heavily influenced by political connections and cronyism.
And then you have newer concepts emerging.
Yeah, things like eco-capitalism or sustainable capitalism. The latter, championed by figures like Al Gore and David Blood, advocates for integrating ESG factors, environmental, social, and governance into business and investment decisions.
ESG, yeah, you hear that a lot now.
Trying to align profit with broader sustainability goals.
Let's circle back quickly to capital accumulation. Our source really emphasizes its central role, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's presented as the fundamental driving force of capitalism, this ongoing process of generating profit and reinvesting it to expand production, wealth, and, well, more capital. Marx's law of value is mentioned as relevant here in understanding how, from his perspective, surplus value is extracted from labor and then accumulated by the capitalists.
Right.
In more modern economics, this process is often referred to simply as capital formation or investment.
And wage labor, as we've discussed, is kind of the other side of that coin.
Precisely. It's the selling of labor power under a contractual agreement, with capitalists typically owning the means of production. The source notes how the understanding or description of the capitalist's role in organizing this labor has evolved over time, from owner-manager to perhaps shareholder or financier.
Okay. Finally, no discussion of capitalism would be complete without considering the criticisms leveled against it. Our source lists a wide range of concerns.
Indeed. And these critiques come from various political and philosophical viewpoints, anarchist, socialist, religious, nationalist perspectives, you name it.
What are some common themes?
Common allegations include exploitation of workers, alienation from one's labor, inherent instability leading to economic crises like recessions or depressions, environmental unsustainability due to the constant drive for growth, generating excessive inequality, the commodification of things that maybe shouldn't be treated as mere commodities like healthcare or education, undemocratic tendencies, uneven global development favoring richer nations, and even the potential for the erosion of human rights in the pursuit of profit, sometimes linked to imperialism or war. It's a long list.
It is. But our source also touches on some counter-arguments, or perhaps nuances.
Yes, it does. Some argue that many negative outcomes aren't inherent to capitalism itself, but rather reflect the ethical choices made by individuals within the system or the specific regulatory frameworks or lack thereof within which it operates.
So the rules of the game matter.
Exactly. The debate between figures like Milton Friedman, arguing the sole responsibility of business is profit, versus others like John Bogle or Lon Fuller, advocating for broader ethical considerations, is relevant here. The discussion also touches on the complex issue of inheritance and whether that's a fundamental part of capitalism or a separate issue related to wealth distribution and opportunity.
Okay, so to wrap up this deep dive into capitalism based on our source material, we've seen it's a really multifaceted system. There's no single easy definition. It has a long, complex, evolving history, and it has this set of core characteristics: private property, profit motive, markets, wage labor, accumulation that kind of drive its engine. Understanding these fundamentals, even through a broad lens like the Wikipedia overview we use today, provides a really crucial framework for analyzing the economic world around us, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. It helps make sense of so much of what we see happening economically and politically.
So this leaves us with a final question for you, the listener, to maybe ponder. Given the diverse forms capitalism has taken throughout history and the ongoing debates surrounding its impacts, both positive and negative, what specific aspects of capitalism do you find most impactful or perhaps most deserving of closer scrutiny in our world today?